The next two subsections in this chapter, which deal with policy standards and guidelines, and then also with the security standards and ISO 17799, I'm not going to go into too much because Chapter 8 in this textbook is specifically devoted to policies. And that's what you're going to do in your Phase 4 of the semester project, is to develop your own policies for your company. I think you can go ahead and just read this, get some background information, and then I'll have more to say when we get to Chapter 8. The good thing is that moves us right into the last part of the chapter, which is classifying information. And there are a couple of different perspectives you can have in terms of information and classifying it. One way to look at this is the data that resides on your servers. Almost all of it is probably going to be considered internal only. You don't want the whole world being able to access stuff that's on your servers unless you've actually got a publicly available website. The diagram that they show at the beginning of this section shows maybe 20% of your information, corporate information, can be considered public. 80% is considered internal and restricted. And there is a distinction between internal and restricted. Some of your financial information may only be available to your accounting department and maybe officers of the company. And for day-to-day business operations, the rest of your employees don't really have anything to do with that data, and they shouldn't have access to it. Another thing that you can look at in another perspective of classifying information might be the information or whatever your product is that you make available to the public. It's not necessarily data that lives on your servers, but things that you put out in the public realm. The book talks about doing beta testing, and this is a very common practice for software companies. They'll develop a new version of, let's say, a browser, and before they release it to the general public, they will send that out to a group of people who agree to evaluate it and provide feedback on that. You want to make sure, or the companies that are doing this want to make sure that their beta testers aren't going to take this product and give it out to the competition. So most of the time there's going to be some sort of a non-disclosure agreement that the testers will sign that says, I'm going to keep this information confidential, I'm not going to tell people about what's in this version of the software, and I'm not going to make public the problems that I find. And so that's kind of a company's protection about letting things out into the public but still trying to maintain some control over it. That is considered limited distribution. If you go through the rest of the chapter, they talk about full distribution, and then they classify private information into internal and restricted. There is a section here on government and military classifications, and I really haven't done very much work with government or military classifications, so you can go ahead and read through this. Even though it might have some different nomenclature, the idea still is that there are different levels of accessibility to data and that only certain people should have access to different levels of the data. We've used the term access control in lots of different ways, sometimes meaning physical access and sometimes meaning logical access. And here we're going to talk about some of the different access control methods that you can use to make sure that your data remains secure. I think that one of the prerequisites for this class is the 210 class, where we spent quite a bit of time talking about file system security. We talked about NTFS permissions, we talked about share permissions, and we also talked about the concept of least privilege, where if somebody doesn't need to write to a file, they're fine with read access, then don't give them read access. You don't want to solve a problem where someone needs read access and you're having issues getting that to work. You don't just want to open that up and give them administrative access just to solve the problem. So you want to make sure that you set up the principle of least privilege anytime you're talking about either network security with rights, which are tasks that you can do, or permissions, which often involve access either to devices or to data. There is a brief discussion of the deny function, which you can do in almost any file system or operating system, where you can explicitly say, Joe Schmo cannot access this, and if that's the case, then that's going to be part of your access control list. The book also discusses 5 different security models that you can use to maintain data confidentiality, and also you can use that for some data integrity as well. So the first one that they talk about is Bell LaPadula. This is something that was designed for the military to deal with classified information. And if you look at the diagram, what they're showing is that they've got 3 different levels of data classification. They have sensitive, they have confidential, and they have secret. And what they're showing is that we're working with data that is classified as confidential. In Bell LaPadula, you can't read up, meaning that you can't read information that is above your security clearance. And you can't write down or take information that is considered confidential and accidentally write it to a lower level security. And so what you're trying to do is make sure that that data doesn't become available to someone with a lower security clearance, and at the same time you make sure that higher level data is not available to anybody working at the confidential level. The BIBA model is something that was developed after Bell LaPadula, and it deals more with integrity of data and making sure that you don't mix data from different levels and have that affect the content. What they're showing here is that if we've got three classifications of public, limited use, and restricted, number one, in the limited use area, you can't read the public information. And the idea here is that data that may be less accurate or that may be less reliable is not going to affect what you're doing at the limited use area. And so you're kind of isolating your knowledge based on only what's available at your security level. By the same token, you can't take limited use data and write that into restricted data areas or data classifications. Again, the same thing comes into play. Your limited use data may be more reliable than what you have in the public, but it still may be less reliable than what is required for restricted access. By making sure that you can't even read lower level data, and you certainly can't change anything that's above it, you're making sure that the data stays in that particular layer and doesn't affect anything either up or below it. In the Clark-Wilson model, this is a completely different approach than either of the first two that we talked about. In Clark-Wilson, what you do is you've got they show here a read application or a write application that the user must go through in order to make changes either to sensitive or to public data. Maybe the user can only read things at the sensitive area, but they can write things that are public. And so you've got a layer of software control that probably does some authentication or other types of access control that will make sure that the mechanism for making changes or accessing that is programmatically controlled. The next model that the book discusses is called information flow. This again is a programmatic control, and what you have is some sort of a security application that monitors what can be done at a given level and exactly how that process occurs. The example that they give in the book is, let's say that somebody is coding and making some program changes, and let's say that they've got a particular module that they're working on. If they check that out of the library, make changes, and then save that back to the library, if that's the only copy of the data, there isn't a way to revert back to an earlier version if you've completely overwritten what you had initially there. Could be that in terms of coding, you may want to go through a whole bunch of more testing before you actually say, yes, this is what we want to go with. And so what the book suggests is that in terms of writing, maybe what you want to do is maintain different versions. You may maintain 15, 20, or an endless number of versions. Maybe you maintain old versions for 9 months or something. Anyway, the idea is when you're looking at a write operation that you want to make sure that you have a way of going back to earlier versions. There may be some reason that you need to do that. The last model that they discuss is the non-interference model. And here what you have is isolation. Things that occur at one level in the organization are not necessarily going to affect things either at a higher or a lower level. Whatever you do is independent. And this is real standard in terms of just your ISO layers. Things that happen at layer 1 don't necessarily, it doesn't matter what the details are that happen at layer 1. Layer 2 is going to expect signals of a certain type and have the data in a certain format, and so it doesn't really matter if you're using wireless, if you're using wired. All it cares about is making sure that what is presented at those different layers is acceptable. So this is kind of along those same lines, and that's what non-interference is. It doesn't matter what the internal workings are as long as whatever's presented across the different layers is what's expected, then you're in good shape. This wraps up Chapter 6. You'll have an exam over Chapters 4, 5, and 6 at the completion of this. If you remember in Chapter 4, I did have a couple of handouts that talked about different protocols and then also talked about different wireless protocols. Make sure that you know those. We are going to have some questions on the exam that will be similar to what you had on the first exam. I have a question for you. I've got 4 answers. You need to pick the right answer and then explain to me why each answer is right or wrong. We'll also have more short answer questions where I ask you to, well, what are 5 types of this, or what are 2 types of this? So it's not all going to be just making sure that you know definitions. The exam is going to be an hour. It will not be a document that you download and work on and then upload. It's actually going to be an exam that you work through online. That's one of the reasons that I had you go through and make sure that you could go through the practice test. The exam will be available from shortly after midnight until about 11:55 on the day of the exam. Good luck, and we'll see you again for Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to be an optional in-class lecture, and I'll record that information so those of you who can't attend that lecture can still get the information.